Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Gina Smarecki. I am the events manager here at Newspire, and I'm happy to be your host for today's live session. Today's webinar features three of our cybersecurity subject matter experts. We are bringing together HR and security professionals to discuss the challenges that HR encounters in the face of an evolving threat landscape. Today, we'll be sharing practical tips on how HR and cybersecurity departments can work together to protect employee and company data. If you have questions during the presentation, please submit them in the Q&A tab on the bottom of your screen. We'll try and leave a few minutes at the end for your questions. This webinar is also being recorded, so just so you know, if you can't stay the whole time, you will receive a follow-up email and be able to watch the recording. So at this time, it is my great pleasure to introduce you to our speakers today, Emily Burke, Mike Pedrick, and Phillip Smith. Emily is the VP of Human Resources at Newspire. She's responsible for global talent acquisition and engagement, performance management, professional development, strategic employee management, and nurturing the amazing culture at Newspire. Emily has a long history in IT and networking, along with over 8 years of cultivating a depth of HR knowledge and experience. She brings a uniquely combined background and passion for both business and technology. Mike is the VP of Cybersecurity Consulting at Newspire. He's been providing technology, security, compliance, and risk management consulting services to organizations across several industries for nearly 20 years. In addition to his role at Newspire, he is an accredited trainer and chapter board member for ISACA, mentoring cybersecurity and risk management professionals. Phillip is the Director of Security Program Operations at Newspire. He's a veteran of both the information security and military intelligence communities. Phillip has nearly 2 decades of experience taking a pragmatic approach to technology and security across both large enterprises and small to medium-sized businesses. As both the Director for Security Program Operations and Security Architect for Newspire, he drives improvements in both the internal security program and the customer-facing processes and technologies. All right, so before I go ahead and hand this over to our speakers, we'd like to get your input on our poll. Let me go ahead and launch the poll here. So the poll question reads, do you have a formal security policy defining how to safeguard sensitive employee information? Yes, it's up to date. Yes, we probably need to update. We're working on it, or no. If everyone could take a moment and cast their votes. I'll go ahead and turn it over to Mike.
Thank you, Gina. I want to take this opportunity to say that I've worked with a lot of organizations over the years that have been, for one reason or another, reticent to record or document their information security policy, whether it's because they thought it was a matter of bureaucracy, it was a bunch of red tape for the sake of red tape, or, they've just spent the last several years making sure the doors were open and the lights were on and didn't have time or didn't make time for defining a formal security policy. I will also say, just as a precursor to the conversation we're having today, that in a lot of organizations, the genesis of the information security policy starts with human resources, not within IT and IS. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that.
All right, I see a good number of responses there, so I'll go ahead and end the poll and publish the results there.
That's impressive. 57% say that it's up to date. Emily, I'd like to ask, what do you think about that? How do you feel about HR policies being 57% of our respondents say they're current?
I think it's impressive. I know when we talked about it before, we thought maybe it would fall higher in those middle two categories. But that's great. I mean, a lot of this is going to fall on HR, which is why we wanted to do this. It's important that HR reaches out and creates that relationship with IT. What IT doesn't know is out there, they can't help secure. And HR has that, it's the one part of the company that's kind of on blinders for the IT department. So it's really important that HR takes that initiative. So I think those are really impressive numbers. They're better than what we anticipated. So that's fantastic.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. All right, so why are we here? Let's go through this agenda real quickly. We're going to start out by talking about the types of data that human resources manages. We're then going to talk about some of the key cybersecurity risks that HR faces, or is at least related to the information that HR manages. We're going to talk about ensuring employee security, securing the organization, and we're going to give you our top recommendations, what should be a part of your cybersecurity program related specifically to human resources data, employee data, and company data. And we'll finish out with some resources. You're going to want to keep a close eye on that slide. We've pulled together some really fantastic external resources for you. And hopefully we'll have time to go through your questions and answers. And I'm really looking forward to that part. It merits mention that if you submit a question and we don't get the chance to address it during the webinar, don't fret. We'll reach out to you, or keep an eye on Newspire's feed for content related to your questions. Okay. And with that, Emily, talk to us about what HR manages.
Right. It's a lot, and it's a lot of sensitive information. When you look at the employee data, it's not just employee data, it's also their spouse, their children, their social security numbers, their addresses, their birth dates, so pretty much everything you would need to steal someone's identity, including someone's child. So as far as, what is the level of pressure for HR individuals to keep that data secure? It's high. It's a big responsibility. And I know, based on conversations I've had with many of my HR peers, that we take it very seriously. And sometimes, we do the best that we can, but there are ways that are evolving to do it in a more secure fashion. Especially now with the change to remote workers. So a lot of what we used to do in person via paper, we can't do anymore if they're states away. So, some of the things that we have to look at, with the demographic, like I talked about, that's everything you would need to steal someone's identity. And if it's one of the children, it's even worse because they might not see it for a really long period of time. But also just banking information, I think that goes without saying, routing numbers and for your bank and your account number is pretty helpful, especially if you have the rest of the demographic information with age, gender, birth date, etc. That's gonna be hard to stop once they have that information. And then the company data. So not only is the financial data, again, routing numbers, etc., very sensitive, but also like the hierarchy. If you think about knowing who reports to who, as far as when you get into the social engineering stuff that we'll talk about later, it's very beneficial to know whose boss is who. And if you go 2 levels above and you send that, if you haven't received that email saying, emergency, I need this information by, in 10 minutes, or the company is going to go under, and it's your boss's boss and it looks legit, a lot of people will react. And so if you're not prepared via some of the things that we'll talk about later, it really is a high stakes game. So that's sort of what's at stake. Now we can talk about maybe some more of the threats.
Absolutely. So let's go back one. All right. So obviously, when we talk about threats, and we're specifically focused today on human resources data, so data about employees, data about, Emily, I love that you brought up the fact that some of the information that is collected during traditional hiring practices or even termination practices actually has some applicability to spouses, children, et cetera. I think that's a point that doesn't get enough attention out in the larger conversation. So I really appreciate you bringing that up. So let's talk about threats real quick, right? So I like to put these threats into 2 buckets. There's internal versus external. Now, internal threats, of course, are going to be employees, insiders, folks that are already a part of our organization. And when we think about threats from those individuals, there's 2 buckets that falls into. There's going to be intentional threats or malicious activities by disgruntled employees. Maybe they didn't get the promotion they were looking for. Maybe they didn't get the raise the last cycle. maybe they don't like their boss, whatever the case may be. That's malicious activity by a insider who we've already let them in. We've already given them access to the environment. They're able to, interact with systems that external threats don't necessarily interact with, and so on. Now that's intentional, that's malicious. The other opportunity for employees is for accidental compromise, accidental leakage of data, or deletion of data, right? I mean, for those of us who have had roles in information technology or information security where we've interacted with folks in the organization, I'm sure all of us remember a time when somebody came to us and said, hey, I accidentally dragged a folder into another folder, and I don't remember what folder I dragged it into, but now I really need that folder. I can't find, please help, right? And you can imagine the time spent on trying to scour that directory to find what they'd moved. Now, it's also worth mentioning that our workforce post-pandemic is largely distributed. We're working from home. There's a lot of us that are working from home, or at least from remote environments. And so there's a lot of internal threats associated with that. A lot of remote work, or a lot of data is exposed by virtue of working in environments that are not on the company network or in company facilities, company-owned and managed facilities. And then finally, password hygiene, of course, is always a recurring topic. Who has good hygiene? Who doesn't have good hygiene? Reuse of passwords, bad passwords, writing down passwords, and so on. So setting aside the internal threats real quick, of course, there are always external threats. And you can imagine that when an employee is inside of our organization and they have access to things, of course, they can be more impactful to the organization. But when internal employees, existing employees, become former employees, if we're not doing a good job of remediating that access, then they're former employees, they don't have a vested interest in the organization, and they could still perpetrate attacks or compromises of the organization with that access they previously had. And then the other category that I think, ignoring the stereotypical, hacker in a hoodie in a basement in Siberia, the other external category, of course, would be vendors or third parties that we interact with. And it's worth mentioning that every organization has companies that they take data from for critical processes, or that they give data to for similarly critical processes. I can't think of a single organization I've encountered in the entirety of my career that didn't work with another organization in some fashion. And so there's always going to be risks with regard to that data sharing process. Now, again, we're talking about employee data in this case, which leads directly into a fantastic conversation about data privacy. Now, it merits mention that a big thing that we recommend is privacy by design. In simple terms, and I'll leave it to Philip to expound on this in just a couple of moments, but in simple terms, privacy by design means it's already there. It's already baked in. It's a part of our environment, a part of our cybersecurity program, just a part of what we do. And if we did nothing else, then the data is intrinsically protected. Now, privacy legislation is a big conversation here in the United States. 5 years ago, the European Union launched their GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, and it gave a lot of power to consumers with regard to their personal data. Multiple states in the US have adopted similar legislation, and I'll lean on California as the first and best example with their CCPA standard. Again, that puts power into the hands of the consumers. But what it also means is that organizations like Newspire, like yours, have to institute specific controls related to protection and good stewardship of consumer data and employee data. And it's a tough thing to follow. I think a total of 12 states in the United States have already enacted similar privacy legislation, and that number is only going to go up from there. And that's ignoring standards, established standards, long established standards like HIPAA and FERPA, right? And so we have to be intentional. As part of that changing regulatory landscape, we have to be intentional about what information we collect, how we process it, how we store it, how we move that data set from, through the individual, through its life cycle with our organization, and including destruction of that data. We have to do that in a reasonable fashion as well. So with that, Philip, what are your thoughts on privacy legislation?
Yeah, so it's from a security program perspective, right? The privacy by design is really the implementation, the kind of the proactive implementation of least privilege, right? And default to failing secure. Now, you implement that in your solutions, but you'll find the privacy legislation and the employment legislation, right? Those things should both feed your policies and procedures. That's tuned by what HR has defined as sensitive data, so that your responses to any threats and how you are engaging third parties for how they're handling data that you're putting them in custody of are a normal standard operating procedure.
Right, absolutely. Again, IT doesn't know what we have. So if we don't reach out and have that partnership, they don't know how to help us. So here at Newsfire, we have a really close partnership between IT, between security. I'm spoiled. I'll just be honest that I have access to all of these experts. But it's really helped me sharpen my ability to be able to help employees and the company secure our data. And really, when you talk about the destruction of some of that data, it's a double-edged sword. So what IT might not know that HR has is that we have a requirement to keep that data unless someone comes in and asks us to remove that data. So it's a double-edged sword. We have to be able to do both, right? Make sure that it automatically gets kept because we have a legal requirement to do that for a certain number of years. But then also be able to turn around and destroy everything, which means you really have to be proactive and have this plan in place as to how do we organize this information so that we can do one of two opposites, depending on what the person is requesting. And it's a hard place to be. But I think taking that proactive approach beforehand, making sure that all of your employee records are very organized, whether they're digital or paper, being able to keep them if that's what the law is requiring, or destroy them. Again, it gets kind of tricky. But it's really better not to wait for legislation. So we know that there's been changes. We know that even the ones that have already been enacted, there are a number of proposed changes in many different states. So it's really best to start looking at this now. It sounds like we have a group that already is, but if you haven't started, definitely get started now, because if it's not required now, it will be in the future. So yeah, I mean, I think it's a great conversation to have, and it's a tricky one because there's no one size fits all, and the requirements can sometimes be the exact opposite of each other. So yeah, next, let's go ahead and start talking about onboarding. So from an onboarding perspective, it's really an opportunity to set the tone with employees when they come in, that you not only care about their data, but we as a company are also security minded. So that's part of our culture, is that we are going to take that extra step to not only secure the data of employees, but also the company's data. And so in their day-to-day job, if you start off on the right foot with onboarding, this is really important. Later on, months, years down the road, when they have a choice between making a maybe easy send, just attaching it as an email, or sending it through something secure, they might go, oh yeah, this is important to our company. We take these extra steps. We're not allowed to email that type of information. So it's really getting off to the to a good start. It's also, when you're bringing someone on, and a lot of us now are doing this remotely, how do you do that in a secure way? You definitely don't want to use email. You don't want them to, print out something, scan it in, and send it back through email. If they're remote, a lot of us have HRIS systems that we can utilize for the onboarding procedures, so that you can really hit that self-service. There's less middlemen. It goes directly in, and then frankly, it's more accurate because they typed it in themselves, and we're not trying to read it off the paper. I think we've all kind of run into those options before. But say you are just getting into this and your HRIS doesn't have that yet, and you're hiring remotely. There are other options. You can have them email over the less sensitive data, and then call them and use, on the phone and talk about getting that data. They're really going to remember that and know that you took that extra step to make sure that their personal information was secure. But then ongoing too. So the self-service, whenever possible, for many reasons, is a good idea. but the continuous stewardship of open enrollment every year, that we make sure that if somebody has a QLE, they have the ability to go in and change it themselves. And then there's also making sure that if you're able to, I think the next step past that is getting into those APIs. Making sure that your HRIS is talking to maybe your carriers. I don't know, depending on the size of your company, I've heard some tricky stories where information gets held up on the benefit side. So someone signs up, you hand it off to your broker. If you're under 100 lives, sometimes there's a middleman in between the broker and the carrier. And I've heard really tricky stories before on people who needed access to healthcare and couldn't get it because it was stuck in that other area. And on top of that, how do you know what their security practices are? Now you have it in the hands of one more person. So really trying to minimize any opportunity in the APIs, those direct feeds. Not only that, but if you change something in your HRIS and someone forgets to put that life insurance policy in, and then something happens, or health insurance, all of those things to automatically happen for so many reasons. I'm a very big fan of APIs, but security is a big piece of that. But again, it goes back to setting the tone, and it goes, and it also includes making sure that they know that we value their information. And then on the flip side, when we're talking about offboarding, it can get really tricky, right? So depending on the situation, it can be a high emotions situation, and you want it as clean as possible. So this is when your partnership with IT really comes into play. It is important that you can pick up the phone or send a Teams or email to your IT department and say, hey, we're going to have a termination today. Maybe they're remote, maybe they're around. But having a live chat with them and having that partnership where they know you're going to call, say at noon, and you'll have somebody on the phone. You need that to be as fast and as clean as possible for so many reasons, right? It's better for everyone, including the individual, that you're just prepared. But from the company's data perspective, it's a huge opportunity because of those high emotions. You don't want to have 1, 5, 10 minutes in between that phone call and your ability to turn them off, especially if it's remote. So if you have a prior relationship with IT and you can let them know, hey, in a half hour, we're going to have a termination, and then you let them know maybe the name right before. I know that many companies, you're able to just run a script and you turn it all off, but say you don't have that type of sophistication. You could even have just, here are all the different accesses that this access levels that this person has, or systems. How can we, put them in order of importance? Which one needs to go off first? Which one needs to go off second? So there's different, I think, levels of sophistication for securing your organization. But there's always baby steps that you can start making now.
And that offboarding process is really just kind of the continuation of that continuous stewardship, right? Just because you've hit the end of the employee life cycle doesn't mean that the responsibilities for handling and protecting company and employee data go away. So from the company side, making sure that you're recovering equipment, and if you can't recover equipment, have a process in place to be able to delete data remotely. We affectionately refer to as breaking somebody's laptop, right? And then making sure that, as Emily mentioned, that you've got access revocation processes in place so that you don't have that gap of 15, 20 minutes where somebody walks out the door, except now they're really upset because they have to go find another job. And all of those things, again, feed back into the procedures that come out of how your security program is managing these actions. And if you think about them proactively, you take into account the legislation around what you are legally obligated to do with an employee's data, then you're not caught off guard at the end of the employee life cycle. There are no surprises, and it's what your requirements are, and you can deal with any sidebar instances that come up.
Absolutely. Some of the statistics that we talked about earlier this week were a little scary. One of them was 89% of former employees still have access to private apps or data like QuickBooks, Salesforce. And that goes back to just being prepared. And very few even have the ability to, I think it was 5% had a fully automated process but that leaves 95% where, right? But it becomes tricky very quickly. And everyone is well intentioned with those pieces. You know, we think we turned everything off, but that pre-planning is really key.
You know, and those intentions, I mean, you can help tune those, right? So one of the ways that you can secure the organization, in addition to the company data, all right, you do your trainings via learning management system, your social engineering, and your phishing tests. But in the absence of, you know, tacking on more technology solutions, you also have the means to go through and do role-based training and testing, right? Your finance people are going to be much larger targets for fraud of the, hey, you know, I need $3,700 in iTunes cards to sell this client. Versus your IT admins, who are going to be a bigger target for identity theft for their corporate identities. So being able to tune your training and your testing to their role makes them better prepared in the event that, you know, one of those risks actually comes through. And then continuing that, especially now in the remote work environment, right? Ensuring that you've got some kind of centralization of your identity. Single sign-on is a huge boon when it comes to being able to secure remote work, and then being able to reduce the attack surface by having a single point of control. Right, so you can implement multi-factor authentication. You can make sure that, you know, those conduits between these systems are using strong encryption, and then it really just becomes a continuation of the office environment. And then one of the things that we do at Newspire is we like to, as an HR benefit, extend some of those controls to our employees' personal lives. As an example, a password manager, right? When we onboarded our password manager, one of the things we looped into the deal was that there was a personal license that was attached to that corporate license. And it really just serves to continue that culture of security by giving employees the opportunity to use those same types of controls at home, and become used to those being the correct way. So the easy way is the right way. And that continuation as a benefit really helps there. And that mindset also carries over, not just for your technical people, but also for business folks, right? If you have that kind of baked in security culture, when they're engaging third parties and talking about controls, as a benefit of not only that culture, but also the partnership with IT and security, those engagements for third parties can really suss out where those controls are and make sure that the data that HR has identified as sensitive for their systems is being properly handled by third parties.
You know, Philip, I think that's a fantastic point. I actually want to revisit, if I can, that culture piece, right? I like what you had to say about we've incorporated tool sets that people will be able to use in their personal life. Because my experience has been, if you want folks to follow your corporate policies, they have to know why. They have to know why this is important, you know, because there's some measure of productivity compromise or productivity impact in doing a thing. Well, if they think that there's value in doing it, then that impact of productivity sort of vanishes. And before I talk about third-party risk, there is one other point I want to touch on, and it's sort of related to regulatory pressures, external pressures on the culture of the organization with regard to security. There was a case, I want to say it was in 2018 at this point, across the pond in London, or in the UK. I think London, but I don't want to be that specific because I can't commit to it. But there was a woman who fell victim to a business email compromise, and she wired away 200,000 pounds of the organization's money to scammers, which, like, that happens. That's a thing. $200,000 is probably a little more than any of us want to admit to have fallen victim to. But you know, that's a very real, very common attack vector for all organizations in business today. Here's where things went off the rails. The organization fired her and then sued her to try to recover $107,000 pounds of the 200,000 pounds lost. Their argument was that she should have known better. She should not have fallen victim to that particular attack vector. You know, something to the effect of, you know, it was a common sense sort of thing. Of course, this was from an external entity, not from her boss, and so on and so forth. which is kind of a scumbag thing to do from an organizational perspective, but we'll set that aside for just a second. She was able to defend herself. Her attorney defended her by saying there is no evidence. We were not able to find evidence to suggest that the organization had a robust training program and user awareness program that outlined business email compromise. So you can't say that this employee should have known better if you didn't give them the proper training. Now, like I said, I think this was 2018, and I was watching that case with bated breath because I was afraid that if the organization had succeeded, if they had succeeded in recovering losses from the employee, that would set a very, very dangerous precedent. And I'm happy to say that the courts, again, in the UK found in favor of the former employee, and she was not liable for those losses to the organization. So again, lots of pressures. And it merits mention too that you can't say that you have a culture of suspicion, that you have a strong hygiene within the organization if you're not actively working to foster that culture. Now, that culture, again, extends to third-party risk. Now, what I want to talk about here with third-party risk, of course, is that, as I mentioned, we take data from organizations, we give data to other organizations as a part of our standard process flow. And these are critical processes for us to keep the lights on, do what we do as an organization. So I would just stress that you should know what information is changing hands, know what it is, know where it is, know what the entities that you're interacting with, what is their obligation to you, what is your obligation to them, and don't just make assumptions that they're going to be good stewards of that data in the ways that you are, right? So first and foremost, I want to put out there that whatever contracts you're signing with those organizations, ensure that the language exists in that contract that says, thou shalt protect this information to this degree. Lean on frameworks, lean on standards, lean on things like, hey, we're bound by HIPAA. We'd like you to conduct yourself as though you are as well, just as an example. And of course, you also have to put yourself in a posture of suspicion with third-party entities, because you may find yourself in a position where you need to protect yourself and your organization and your employees from those organizations, right?
Yeah,
Now,
and that's
go ahead, Philip.
that'll come out of your partnership between human resources, IT, and security, right? That's the really just kind of getting all three of those functions into the mixing bowl when you're having conversations with these third parties or looking at onboarding these third parties, and make sure that not only you are proactively addressing your data protection requirements, but also consider protecting your organization in the event that something goes sideways.
Right. It's a good idea to pull in your IT. So once you go through and say you're looking at a new LMS, learning management system, or applicant tracking system, whatever it is that you're looking at, it's a good idea once you've dwindled down maybe what you're looking for from a third party provider, you have it maybe down to 2 or 3. It's a good idea at that point to bring in that IT partnership again, bring them into the meetings, have them ask those hard questions. You don't have to be an expert yourself. Just make sure that you make friends with the experts and pull them in, and they can help you with some of those questions. And I know too, in some of the links that will be included in the presentation at the end, there's some resources as to sample questions to ask a third party. And another story that it makes me think of that we all know this one, the Target breach. A lot of people don't know it wasn't Target that lost the information. It was a third party, but who took the hit, right? Target took the hit. We all know it as the Target breach. Target didn't lose the information. So I think who you're friends with from a third party perspective does matter, and asking those hard questions up front is very important.
I think that's a fantastic point. Okay, so let's get to some recommendations, right? We've painted this picture that everything is dire, doom and gloom. The world is just a terrible place from a data protection standpoint. So, all right, let's fixate on a couple of things here. First, as you said, Emily, and I can't stress this enough, right? So partner with all the organizations that are in your sphere during the development of formalizing policies and procedures. And within your organization, I think it's important to note that, as I mentioned at the outset of this webinar, I said I've worked with a lot of organizations where they just hadn't made the time, hadn't taken the time yet to craft a formal security policy, right? If you're still at that phase where you don't have it, don't do it in a siloed fashion. If you're in IT or IS, don't start with a blank sheet of paper. If you're in HR, maybe it's time to pick up the phone, call IT or IS and say, hey, listen, let's put something together. Let's put this policy set together. But regardless, make sure that everybody has a seat at the table and everybody is able to contribute to that process. Remove the middleman, right? Remove the middleman when it comes to any opportunities for exchanging data, or as much as possible, take the human element out of it. Now, Emily spoke at length about leveraging self-service portals and APIs for data flow processes. And I think that's fantastic, because one of the things that it does that is incredible is it reduces the chances for human error in the process, that we don't have transcription errors, we don't have somebody routing a thing to a place that it doesn't belong, and so on and so forth. So, and then the other part of that, of course, is institute least privilege. Bottom line this, folks, if you don't need access to a thing, you shouldn't have access to that thing. It's not an attack on your authority or position within the organization. It's just prudent application of common sense controls. Philip, I hear you love to talk about encryption. Do you want to touch on this next point?
Yeah, ultimately, and that comes out of the like kind of your data handling. Is that once you've identified data that's sensitive, right? I mean, you're protecting that data. If you can't get rid of it, then change it to something else. Or if you need to be able to recover it later on in the process, make sure it's encrypted. And whatever you do, make sure you keep good control of those keys. Right? Use strong authentication methods, multi-factor authentication on all the things. Those are your two biggest friends. And understanding where your risks are, and then applying the right control in the right place. Best things you can do.
Absolutely. Even on some of the smallest things, they make me do it to everything. And they're right, right? But that's what it gets back to what we talked about earlier with understanding the why. So why am I taking these extra steps and doing this extra work? Because it matters, right? It secures not only the company information, but the employee's information, and those both are very important. But I think, the tight coordination, I've said it, I don't even know how many times now, it all starts with that, right? So it all starts with that partnership. So I know on this call, we have some HR folks, we have some IT. And I guess my ask would be, if you're IT, reach out to HR. You might not know what's there that you're not currently securing. And HR, reach out to IT. It has to be that partnership, coming up with plans for onboarding, offboarding, how we want that to flow. And what's out there that we need to secure, or systems maybe that are put in place that we're feeding out to, that those ones don't have the MFA, right? So there's various pieces along the way that you really have to have that partnership with. And if you're not talking to each other, it's just impossible to have that.
Yeah, and coming out of those conversations where they can really help you tune your security training and your testing based on the role, right? Because oftentimes you don't understand the full scope of a role or where it is, and HR will usually give you a pretty good idea in that regard. But also being able to do things from the information security into the human resources side is to be able to say, as an example, have an additional acceptable use policy that administrators have to sign during their onboarding that actually highlights the additional level of responsibility, and do the same for owners of service accounts, so that get it out there in the open and explicit. You're not allowed to log on to a machine with a service account unless this is a business process. This is supposed to be unattended.
Right. And another really big one too, when signing those, you can have something in there that says, if you have access, if you're in finance, if you're in HR, don't log on to Starbucks Wi-Fi and do payroll. It's not a good idea. It might be like, oh, it's due right now and I have to do this, but there are other ways to do it. And Phil, you can probably speak to some of them, but even just as much as, and correct me if this is a bad idea, right? But logging in and doing your own hotspot from your phone is still going to be safer than using that public Wi-Fi to access sensitive employee or company data. We've all, run into those where we're like, oh my gosh, something happened. Tomorrow's a banking holiday and I have to do, or 2 days from now is a banking holiday and I have to do this right now. That is very important. But taking that extra step and not logging into the local, whatever you're at, open Wi-Fi
Yeah. Yeah.
is not a good idea.
And it's an output of that security culture, right? Being suspicious of stuff. And there's that general the general tenet that I like to live by, and I know Mike loves it, and that's that if you're getting a service for free, then you are the commodity.
Right.
Yep.
Right. Nobody's doing it for fun. And it's funny because based on my interaction with you guys, when I'm sitting at Starbucks, if I'm doing anything for work, I'm always looking around. So I'm totally suspicious now. So it worked. You guys have me suspicious.
That's good.
We're not trying to turn into a
Paranoia is
paranoid
healthy.
person, I promise.
Right. But now, we can start looking at some of the resources too. One of the really interesting ones that I found to be very helpful was the U.S. State and Privacy Legislation Tracker. That is really interesting. And if you want to know what state, based on what states you're in, if you want to look that up and see it at a glance, it's a really great resource, along with some of the Newspire stuff on, finding out what those recommended questions would be when you are interacting with third parties, right? Like, what do we even ask them? How do we get started knowing that they're being good stewards of our information?
If I may, just to stress that point about privacy legislation, not every privacy regulation has a right to action on the part of the consumer or the private citizen, but a lot of them do. And it's worth understanding what that means. What does it mean to have that right to action? And how do I exercise it if I want to? How do I demand that somebody delete what information they have on me and so on? So I think the IAPP website is a tremendous resource in that regard that I think everybody should visit. I'm biased as heck, of course. So, again, I think that's a good place to start if you have questions regarding personal data privacy.
And speaking of biased references, right? When you've got the My Newspire, you can actually go to My Newspire and run through a self-assessment, contrary to the previous one, for free. And really, the only portion of your data that will be a commodity is just kind of aggregating responses across industries. But as a resource, it's a good one if you want to try and get a view into what your program looks like.
Right. These are great links if you're in HR to share with your IT partner, maybe to get that conversation started.
Okay. Let's see, what questions do we have?
Yeah, I just want to thank you all for all these interesting stories and examples. I think everyone on the call can relate to some of them. If anyone has any questions, please go ahead and type them into the Q&A tab at this time. We do have a few minutes. We have about 15 minutes left. I do want to quickly mention our next webinar on October 25th, where we'll be talking to automotive dealers about navigating incident and breach response. If anyone on the call happens to be interested in that, we're going to pop that link in the chat box as well. And I also did share all those links that you're seeing on the screen right now, right in the chat. If you want to click into those and take a look at them when you have time, there's some really great information in there. And so let's go into questions here. All right, I see one question here. What are the main items to address in policies and procedures?
I feel like that one's almost entirely aimed at me. So really, it ultimately comes down to ensuring that you have a good view into what your organization considers sensitive and what's worth protecting, and then a view into what controls you apply to protect that data as a resource, right? HR will have specific data elements that are considered sensitive based on multiple pieces of legislation or just security best practices. The same is true for most other frameworks as well, right? You'll get PCI, right? Everyone loves the cardholder data environment and all of the requirements that you have around that. CMMC, if you've got controlled unclassified information, right? It's just another data element. But really, having what you need to protect how your organization has decided to protect it, and then the continuation of that, having a solid understanding of what the organization needs to do in the event that those protections fail or are compromised. Right. If you start with those three things, you can trickle down from there all of the remainder of the stuff to establish a really broad and useful security program.
I think
having those documented means that when something happens, you just go, "Whoa, this is what we're going to do in this instance." So being
right, it's saying in the military, train how you fight, right? And that's if you have trained to respond to stuff going sideways or questions coming up, and you know the answers. Not only do you look like you know what you're talking about, but your responses will be more consistent.
I think it merits mention that the policy set is the embodiment of the organization's expectations, right? Now, we all like to hope that that policy is at least influenced by prudent, respective regulatory expectations, right? Like the organization is setting out to abide by applicable laws and standards. But realistically, again, that policy set is the embodiment of the expectations of the organization. And I feel like you're putting yourself at a disservice if you don't put that information as a business leader, as an organization. If you don't put those expectations into a policy set, you don't really have much say later if those expectations are violated, right? And it merits mention too that I think that a lot of employees, a lot of team members are looking for, demonstrable, self-evident leadership on the part of the organization. And I'm certainly not in favor of, again, red tape for red tape's sake, but having that policy, having those expectations clearly set, again, that's endemic of strong leadership on the part of the organization.
Yeah, and that also gives your IT and your IT security and all of your organizations that support the business. If they understand what the expectations are, then it's much easier for them to implement technologies and processes that make the right way to do things the path of least resistance.
Sure.
All right. Thank you. Here's another question from the group. Here is a single acceptable use policy enough, or should I have additional AUPs for higher risk roles?
I'd say it's worth it to address those higher risk roles with additional acceptable use policies, right? They have additional responsibilities, and the highlighting those as a part of that acceptable use policy, and my dogs agree, is that if it's codified in a document, they've signed it, and the expectation is clear, then it's easier to say yes. These are the things that I need to do based on this role that has more entitlements to stuff.
Right. Whether it be IT that has more entitlements to information, or finance or HR. I mean, there's a number of different, or your executive leadership has access to that as well. But that goes back to that onboarding piece, making sure that you're setting that tone up front, having that extra document that those individuals sign so that they know that they have more access and we expect more out of them, right? So when you were giving that extra access and that extra trust, frankly, here are the requirements and here's our expectation, and you just get off to the right foot.
Yeah, I agree. I do think it's very important to ensure that the controls we institute, the expectations that we institute, especially on privileged user accounts, follow a risk analysis process, right? That we're looking through the lens of risk when we institute those controls. Also one of my biases, but that we're not instituting a thing just because we think we're supposed to, or just because we heard somebody else did it, but that we're taking a measured approach to institution of those requirements. And just to reiterate, that they're documented up front and everybody's aware of them. One thing that I want to add there real quick before we jump to the next question is there's a process that's becoming, I think, sort of default behavior, that when an employee receives the employee handbook, there's an acknowledgement sheet. that says, yes, I have received this thing. Yes, I acknowledge that I'm bound by it. I'm subject to it, etc. There's two ways to look at that. The first, of course, is the more cynical side that says, nobody can say after the fact that they didn't receive the handbook if they pencil whipped their signature on the line that said that they received the handbook. That's just that you're not being truthful to the process. Note that it just says you've received it. Whether or not you read it, digested it, understand it is, that's a different thing altogether.
You want to include that. Most HR folks include, and I understand and agree to.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. What I'm going for there, though, is that they're signing that they have digested that content. It may be a different thing altogether whether or not they actually did, right?
Like everyone reads the handbook.
100%. And everybody reads end user license agreements and the terms and conditions and the privacy. 100%. Totally. Everything.
Yeah. But that's where that tuned training by role comes back in, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Your admins get, or people with administrative access get much more specific training about, what a compromise looks like, especially the phishing training of, very targeted. One of the things that I think is particularly fun as an information security guy, it could just be me, but when we have administrators that have elevated system rights, having targeted phishing tests that look really, really good, so that we can kind of stretch those risk analysis legs for our admins just a little harder, because they're not getting the normal put a link here and go here to sign in. We're like, we can do stuff that's a little more complex, and does a much better job of putting them in a position where they need to be critical about how they're analyzing communications that come in, and again, polishing that culture of security.
Right. And it's they love to use HR, so sometimes we have to send an email, right? Like trying to let people know that this one is legit, because HR gets targeted so much, and same thing with finance. But what Phil's talking about is, if you're going to do a phishing attempt or trying to do training on that, send something relevant to the finance department, or make it sound like it's coming from HR, because that's what the hackers are going to do. They're not just going to send the wide net anymore. They're going to do the spear phishing, right? Where they're really targeted. They know they have the hierarchy, right? Because we didn't secure our company data. They know who reports to who, and they know what that person does in the organization. Maybe they even know that they're a new hire, right? Like that information, that company information of their hire date, means that they're probably in a probationary period and they're trying to please everybody. And this is their boss's boss asking for this information, and he needs it in 2 minutes.
Yep, good stuff.
And I think being that it's Cybersecurity Awareness Month, what a better time to, go and talk to your HR people or your security people, and have that be an icebreaker as a reason for the conversation.
Right, bring them a donut or a cupcake.
Yeah, I was going to go with chocolate.
Yeah.
Chocolate kind of guy.
Find out what they like and bring them that and say, I'd like to partner with you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, we have about 5 minutes left, and one question here. I'll give you guys a couple minutes to answer this before we go ahead and give me 1 minute to wrap up, and we'll leave everyone on time today. But are there any other recent stories? You guys shared some really good stories that relate to this presentation. Or do you have any other recent cyber event stories to share today?
If I can, I want to unpack Target a little more. I know this is an old story, but it actually touches on multiple things that we talked about today. Broad strokes, right? It was an HVAC contractor that was compromised. Mm-hmm. And the attackers were able to pivot from that HVAC entity's environment into Target's environment, right? So we have the third-party risk component, check, right? We have also that the HVAC contractor, I always imagine, whenever I think about this, I imagine that there was somebody in IT that just said, you know what, they're going to be doing a lot, just give them domain admin access, just put them into that group, and that way they can do whatever they want. We don't have to put any extra effort into this. The contractor's account had access to, just about everything, right? So the attackers were able to leverage those credentials all the way down to and including point of sale systems within Target's environment. So that also, Target apparently was not super great at least privilege at that time, right? Poor vendor management, poor application of the least privilege principle. And then also, I think this is one of the things that doesn't get talked about a lot with regard to breach notifications, right? We have an increasing amount of pressure on organizations to make sure that the proper authorities and state entities are aware when you have an incident of material impact to the organization. Target was very slow in releasing the information associated with this particular compromise. And so they sort of took it on the chin a bit when, you know, pundits and folks like me and Philip and even Emily looked at the case and said, what the heck, were you trying to, you know, sweep this under the rug? Why weren't the details of this case made known earlier, right? So that Target breach that's just a gold mine of stuff to talk about whenever we have this particular conversation.
Right. And they tried to go it alone too.
Yep.
You know, and so having partnerships, whether internally or externally, you know, there's partners that you can bring in to help you when these things happen. You know, having people like Mike or Phil, I'm lucky I have them. So if something happens, I have somebody to call. But it's important to have that partnership as well with, you know, other third parties that can help you when you have an incident.
All right, I like that. So if anyone has any or comes up with any other questions, you can always email us at webinars@newspire.com and I will get that to the right person here. Or you can always contact us through our website at newspire.com. There is a brief survey when you exit the webinar. If you'd like to give us any feedback on today's session, we'd certainly appreciate that. We are at 3 minutes, so any closing thoughts from our speakers today?
I'll probably just go back to, you know, go get that donut, go get that muffin, and go reach out. Start with, it all comes back to the partnership. So I think that's, if I was going to say one thing to take away from this, is go start to have that personal relationship, that professional relationship with either IT or HR, depending on what your role is. I think that's where it all starts. So if you don't have that already, you know, go ahead and do that. If you do have it already, they'll still appreciate a donut or a muffin. It's always a good idea.
Yeah, right. You should already know what they like.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
Yeah, but it's that relationship will help put those plans into place so that because my recommendation would be make sure that you know what your obligations are, you know how the company expects you to respond, and that it is it's laid out and it's exercised prior.
All right.
Yeah,
Well,
I don't know how to improve on any of that. So I'll just say thank you for letting me join the conversation with the both of you, and you as well, Gina. Thank you for letting me participate. And thank you also to everybody who attended this webinar. Hope to see you at another one.
yes, absolutely. Thanks everyone for joining us today on behalf of Newspire and our presenters, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks. Bye.